You still there?
Yeah, man, we're
We
live.
have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity.
We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. As if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy.
Silence! The great and powerful Oz knows why you have come.
You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature.
Don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, or what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts.
Thank you. You're beautiful. I love you. Yes. You're beautiful. Thank you. Showtime!
It's time to buckle up for making sense of the madness.
And who loves you? And who do you love?
Hey, everybody. Jason Bermas here. And I got a super interesting episode for you today. So, as you guys know, if you've been following me or watching this show, transhumanism is a huge topic, as well as artificial intelligence. And it's only accelerated despite the fact that I've been talking about this for almost 20 years, really. And, you know, some people have come around and realized that I wasn't so far off. Some people are still extremely skeptical that transhumanism is really happening at an accelerated pace where, you know, human beings don't really understand that automation, artificial intelligence are going to change the social fabric of global society within the next 10 years, like it or not. And whether that means mass layoffs, whether that means an implementation of a UBI system, we still don't know. But joining me today is somebody who I have known now for really almost 3 decades. He is the author of both I'm Sorry Your Warranty Has Expired, Aging, Evolution, and the Science of Staying Young, and Crossing the Rubicon, The Turbulent Road to AI Rule and a World Without Work. He is Christopher Rose. I'm going to be calling him Chris. He is actually Stephen Christopher Rose, PhD. So, Chris, first of all, I want you just to give a backdrop of who you are to my audience, and then we'll kind of get into our relationship and how you got into this arena where you became a PhD. Because, you know, I think you got about a decade on me, right? Right in there. I'll be at 46 in a couple weeks because I'm an old man. And, you know, back in the day, when you first met me, I'd say it was a very different kind of thing. I was just dropped out of college. I mean, you knew me a little bit more, but we got to spend time when I just dropped out of college. It's a little bit post 9/11. I'm one of the few people on the planet questioning this thing, let alone in New York at a fraternity house while I'm 22 years old. It's not like that was received positively. By the way, everybody.
I remember it like it was yesterday, sitting next to you in the bedroom, looking at the planes go past the World Trade Center.
So again,
Explosion.
yeah, just let everybody know who you are, and then we'll kind of get into our relationship and how it's evolved over the years and how you got into this topic in the first place. Because even then, I don't think either of us were really concerned either with geopolitics on that level or certainly the technology that's now driving it.
Well, I'm someone who's always been interested in science and the future, for sure, which is why I pursued a degree in bioengineering. Ultimately, it became a PhD because I was interested in how aging works and had this basic belief that if we approach human disease from an aging perspective, we can develop a much more effective way of dealing with illness and sickness than the current method. And along the way, I had an appreciation for artificial intelligence, and I thought I need to understand artificial intelligence and machine learning because it's going to help make me a better scientist. And that kind of took on a life of its own because it's really a very engrossing and just fascinating area that's so woven and embedded into everything we do now that it's apparent to me that I definitely, that was time well spent.
So let's talk about where you think we are, first of all, because I think we're in a pretty dangerous place. You just started off talking about the fact that we don't necessarily treat illness in the way that we should. And I think that anybody out there that's really paying attention realizes, and it's even been exposed, in TV series that have dramatized things like OxyContin, et cetera, that I believe that there's been a suppression of medicine that often works and is not necessarily patentable and would extend people's lives. When we were younger, it was almost expected that you would get into your 80s, maybe 90s, unless something horrific happened, right? It was generally dying in your 60s or 70s, early 70s anyway. It was kind of, younger, in my experience. Most of the grandparents were in those 80s, et cetera. Now, 65, 70, it's almost the norm. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with environment, diet, obviously, social culture, but especially, and I don't want to get too much into it because there's still certain things you can't say in this arena. The COVID 1984 nightmare really did expose that, right? They weren't talking about natural immunity. They certainly weren't talking about a diet where, you wanted to keep that immune system up, supplementation of things like D3. They were telling you to stay out of the sunlight, which obviously has a natural, it's the life force of the planet, including us. We need it for natural vitamins. And I'm not saying that, naturopaths or all alternative medicine is the real deal. There's a lot of hokum out there. There's a lot of salesmen. There's a lot of grifters. But essentially, a lot of the baseline stuff that we've known forever has been completely disregarded. And then anything that quote unquote cures something, I can't remember the last time there was a cure for anything. Right. And we were told, again, when we were kids, we were going to live past 100. We were going to cure cancer. I still remember Jerry's Kids, right? Every year they would have that telethon. What kind of real progress have we made? I'd love to get your take.
Well, being in the longevity space for the last several years, I learned a lot. I gained a lot of insights into how fundraising works in this realm in particular. And I don't think it's that much different in the larger realm of things. But one of the things you see happening is aggressive promotion of preclinical work. And it's put across in such a way that, it makes it sound like this thing we've got here is going to be a slam dunk. And the people who are doing this because they're trying to raise the immense amount of money you need to move a small molecule drug typically through clinical trials and get it to the market. And that amount of money is astronomical due to all sorts of systemic barriers and so forth that, essentially you're talking about an average expenditure of $2.4 billion or something in that neighborhood to get a drug from the bench where, it's first conceived and someone's identified something has potential all the way through human trials, which is daunting, but it incentivizes people to go to great lengths to get money. And so in the process of doing that, not everything they say is necessarily genuine, and they generally overstate the cases. And then on the other side, the pharmaceutical side, you have people greening patents because they're trying to get as much money out of a patent as possible. And oftentimes what happens is because they're in a particular line of work, say it's Alzheimer's, they may have crafted a better drug, but they don't want to let that drug out to the general public because they have to run out the patent on the current drug. Otherwise, their investors aren't going to be happy with them. So you have this very tricky balance. And that's, that's probably the kindest, most conservative view I can offer.
I think it's overtly kind, sir. just to give a few examples. And
Clearly,
again,
there are systemic problems with the pharmaceutical system
yeah,
and drug development.
I would say this, and I want to preface this with this is not advice, and I am not a doctor. However, in the arena of cancer, the Joe Tippin story is certainly one that now I've covered for well over half a decade. The guy's still alive. He went through all the traditional treatments, including chemo. I believe he was either in his late 60s, early 70s at that time. And his fenbenzidol protocol with high-grade turmeric and fish oil, they've got clinical studies now. And they've been doing them, and they've even had some success. And again, this isn't for everybody. I'm just saying, go check out the trials in something like pancreatic cancer, which is extremely lethal. You don't hear about that. The controversy with ivermectin after the horse paste period. There are now people acknowledging again that these anti-parasitics, fenbenzidol also being one of them, I mean, is a dog dewormer, everybody. This is a horse dewormer. Also seems to have some clinical benefits. Extremely cheap, extremely generic, extremely available globally, and we don't hear about them. Instead, Chris, when I am, scrolling late night on the networks of the History Channel and all these other things, I see a bunch of advertisements for two types of drugs. They are the weight loss semaglutides all over. Everybody's just having a blast. Can't wait. Ooh, yeah. Or HIV drugs, which literally affect a minuscule part of the population. And again, they're playing drums. It's a big happy time. You know what's not a happy time? Getting diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Okay? Right. I think that I still didn't go extreme enough, but you see my point, right? It seems like it is profits over people, and these are not, medicine.
For sure.
Yeah.
All the major corporations are driven by profit. And even when it appears that they're doing good in the name of getting a better image in hopes that it will improve their bottom line. That's the way they are by design. There was a famous book some years ago by Joel Bacon called The Corporation, where he really kind of outlined how corporations tend to function like psychopaths qualitatively. The characteristics of a typical corporation are very psychopathic. They do everything in the interest of raising money. Even when they do kind and gentle and things that appear friendly, they have to serve the stock payers by design, or the stockholders by design. So, they get fined $2 billion. They've already done the calculus before they got fined that $2 billion. They know that it was a good idea to break the law in an instance because they'd be able to meet the requirements of the fine, and overall, it would swing in their direction.
And that's my thing. None of these people are ever held actually criminally accountable, okay? And that on top of, again, that investment factor, it's that scene in Fight Club in the very beginning where he's at the motor accident and he's got to decide whether or not enough people are going to die that they're going to do a recall. What's going to cost more money, the payouts or the recall? Yeah. And that equation has nothing to do with actual human life. And that is extended. And really, that was a lot of the commentary, by Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote that book. I would encourage everybody to go read the book. I mean, the movie's an excellent representation.
I think plausible denial is also woven into the system.
Always. Well, isn't
right.
it? That's the whole. All right. So that brings me not to sorry your warranty's expired, but your other book, Crossing the Rubicon: The Turbulent Road to AI Rule and a World Without Work. And I would argue that AI's main thing right now, other than obviously we're moving into automation, obviously we're moving into realms of not only image and video generation, but these large language models becoming AGIs and the interaction of them being ever more human. Right now it's in an auditory sense, but it's also going to be coupled by visuals in a short manner. Right now, AI is programmed narrative management, full stop. Full stop. Show me all the breakthroughs for the public it's made. And yet, I have guys like Dennis Bushnell of NASA, chief scientist there for decades, left a couple years ago, talking about a gentleman named Stephen Thaler I'm wondering if maybe you are aware of Thaler by any chance.
Rings a bell.
So Thaler, many, we're talking now a couple decades, maybe more ago, created his own artificial intelligence that was interwoven into the military and corporate complex. So some of the examples he gives is that he's made better warheads for the Defense Department and better toothpaste for Palmolive, and is able to do the work of buildings full of people. And Thaler had created something called the imagination machine, is what he was referring to it. Now, recently, with the AI craze and the fact that Thaler's been in on this for a very long time, I think it was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago now, because I've been covering it, he brought it to court, and he wanted his imagination machine to be able to copyright the artwork it had created. So in other words, you're giving some kind of, I don't want to declare it humanity, but it's certainly trying to blur those lines. That now an AI can somehow copyright something that it's created, even though at its essence it is a large language model that's training off of everything around it. He lost that case.
Theoretically, you could have, corporations have personage, the rights of a legal person. And they also have essentially immortality, unless the corporation is wound down or legally deconstructed. And it's certainly feasible within the very near future that agentic AIs could form corporations and run them. So basically you have an artificial intelligence entity running a corporation that has personage and irrevocable rights almost. It's
well, it's dystopian. That what you just described is extremely dystopian.
Especially when you're unemployed, sitting on a park bench, wondering how the fuck you're going to get your next meal. Sorry.
So no. That's hey, I get it. It's an emotional topic. It's okay. We've got presidents dropping F-bombs these days. That's anyway, right. Drop one. That is part of my issue. Okay, now I don't know how much you're aware of the current stranglehold on artificial intelligence by the military-industrial complex, but during midway through the Biden administration, they had created something, and it's extended into the Trump administration. I don't want this to be a left. It's not a left-right thing. It is essentially an extension of the Department of Defense saying that there will be no real private AI companies. So they have a CAIO program, that is Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer program. And every single one of these companies that has any type of software or hardware, or university, by the way, that's covered. As you know, there are many grants. That's very an interwoven system. They're going to be forced to have a CAIO, and that CAIO is going to have at least a top secret clearance. Now, they are under full audit of the Defense Department on all software and hardware. And the only institutions that are essentially able to escape this are the intel and defense communities and their subsidiaries. And my big argument has always been that Google in particular has always been a military-industrial complex company. It is heavily...
I think they all are. They have to be at this point.
Well, even in the beginning. If you look at the beginnings of Google with Sergey and Page, okay, they actually wrote a thank you letter to both DARPA and NASA because DARPA gave them the initial code for the search engine that essentially won the National Library Initiative. And that National Library Initiative was at the tail end of the 90s, okay? And basically they were trying to digitize the world's print data. Okay, so that was the National Library Initiative. They ended up winning that prize, and then in short order, they were then seed funded by In-Q-Tel, which is the Central Intelligence Agency's arm. They were then fitted with Eric Schmidt, who is still Defense Department National Security Council to this day, also steering member on Bilderberg. Their last real competition in the video arena was YouTube, which they bought up for $8 billion, I believe, in 2008 or 9. And I would argue that's actually the last true startup tech company. Okay, so it is the military, and by the way, they've partnered with NASA on quantum computing and artificial intelligence, and back in 2019 declared dominance. All right, it's not a private company. that's why whenever I talk to, even these conservatives, I say, we're kind of in a techno-fascistic state anyway, aren't we? I mean, the merger of government and private corporations, that's the definition of fascism. That, I know everybody wants to put it into a race thing or whatever. I'm sorry, guys, I'm not into we're a species. And right now, this is actually threatening the entire species, this alliance. So it's bigger than that. I'd love to get your thoughts. Being someone that kind of studied on the inside, and then I kind of want to get into that study, what led you through that process, because I know that you studied over at Harvard and ended up in Albany.
Yeah. Well, there's, an AI arms race in effect happening, right? There's this, at least the idea that this is happening. We're in competition with China, the other major world power, and we're racing to get to artificial general intelligence. And we're trying to get there first, and we're assuming that if we don't, we're going to be at such a tremendous strategic disadvantage that we're going to be screwed. So there goes the Defense Department's initiative or interest in doing everything they can to speed forward the development of artificial intelligence without allowing breaks of any kind. So this is a matter of concern for everybody everywhere, but at the same time, it's a bit of a conundrum because we really don't want to be leaps and bounds behind China in their development of artificial intelligence. So what do? We can't completely deregulate the industry, but we don't want to hobble it too much. This is the thinking anyways, right? So for instance, there was some recent talk about essentially making it impossible for states to regulate AI at the state level. And the argument behind this, driven mostly by tech moguls and the people they influence within the government, was something like, listen, if you do this, the regulatory hurdles you're going to set up are going to slow everything down, and that's going to put us hopelessly behind our opponents. You can't do that. So they set it up, is my understanding, basically, so that all this stuff could be modified and regulated, but only at the federal level.
So
that's
let's talk about that, all right? Because here's my big issue. All right. Number one, with that being said, like if China is such a threat, for instance, Google, I just mentioned Google, and I mentioned Eric Schmidt. And it was either 2017 or 18, right around there. Google got caught because they weren't making it public knowledge that they were working on and creating Dragonfly, which was the Chinese censored internet, okay? And Schmidt gets asked about that in the European press, in the UK. And Schmidt's like, well, I can't tell you much about it. I've actually moved on. You want to check out Sergey Brin, blah, 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 blah. So obviously, there's a huge corporate partnership. Forget about the fact that in that tech industry, you've got a lot of the same parts being driven cheaply through China. The hub there is essentially South Korea that's been a proxy of, our tech since the Korean War. That's why that's allowed to be there. That's why NVIDIA is there, etc. They're kind of that gateway into the Asian hardware. But we gave them the software. And Chris, I would argue, especially after the COVID 1984 nightmare, there were already shades of that quote-unquote censored internet. It's not even Chinese-styled censored internet anymore. It is censored internet. The biggest search engine in the world, which is Google, censors the ever-loving truckins out of us. And then the second largest search engine, which is YouTube, which is what they own, and the first largest video platform, does the same damn thing. And we're already here in that narrative management. Now, with AI, you don't even, when you search something, you get the Google AI overview. We're about 18 months away from forget about the overview. It's going to be an AI avatar that looks 100% human and is appealing to you, okay, and what you think is authoritative because you're being spied on all the time the last 20 plus years. It's going to be catered to you that you're going to want to click on it, and it's going to be the authoritative answer, and it's going to be the same type of bullshit narrative management that we have today. That's the problem I have. And that's happening on a hyper level. So do you think that you're able to circumvent that? And then, again, going back to these authoritative sources, you studied at one of the highest levels of academia. What did you see behind the scenes?
Well, it depends which particular topic we're talking about, but in this arena specifically, I would add to what you said by saying these tech behemoths shouldn't be looked at as like companies working with the government. They should be looked at essentially as like players on equal footing with an intention to just dominate. But the currency they use is data. And they're absolutely going to control the data because that's fundamental to controlling people and controlling their profits. Their data pipelines are infused into every single company everywhere, and they don't want to just dominate and control the United States. They want the world. So they're going to try and get as much of a foothold as they can in China before China evolves all their own technology. They want to be the first ones there, and they're going to use the data they have to nudge and manipulate everyone to fall in line with whatever their worldview happens to be and whatever their mission ultimately is, which is to some extent behind closed doors, but it's not really like that hard to figure out.
Well, unfortunately, I think I want to get into this later. I think that we have enough meat on the bone here that the first half of this can really be on AI, but I think it's a transhuman agenda and maybe even a post-human one, which is extremely alarming. But let's go back to kind of that, not only narrative management, but you just said it. You can't just look at them as nation states because they're not. And they are really looking for global domination of information. Now, I think AGIs already exist. I think that they are well beyond what they're showing us with things like ChatGPT. And you notice with things like ChatGPT or even Google's VO, which is the image generation / video generation, it's all done through the cloud. Now, I know what I can do here at home. You know me, I'm a big dork. I put all this stuff together. Probably got a dozen video cards I'm not even using in the other room. If I were able to actually use software and utilize my video cards, I could have image generation. It wouldn't be as quick, but they're not going to give me that. Instead, it's always going to be online, just like my Adobe's been for the past decade plus, and they just raised the price. It's always going to be limited to what, because you know what? I pay for that Adobe. A lot of times I try to generate an image, and it's against policy. And you know me, I'm such a bigot that obviously they should be doing that to me. Again, narrative management. So when you see that and you see the amount of energy that they're telling you this is going to be, I'm sure you know about the data centers, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
Fascinating.
well, what's really fascinating in my mind is how anti-human they are. So you're telling me now that Meta, aka Facebook, is going to build a center the size of almost Lower Manhattan in Kentucky, and is going to have on-site mini nuclear facilities to power
Absolutely.
that data.
100%. I guarantee you right now, all those major tech companies are pouring tremendous amount of money into the development of nuclear technology, fusion, fission.
Well,
whatever it
I
is,
would argue that
small
technology.
molecules in their backyard because they need the power to continually enhance the automation and the data collection that enables them to do what they do. They absolutely there's not enough electricity on the grid to meet the future vision of what AI can do, and also supply electric to everyone. The grid itself is a bottleneck. So they're putting a lot of energy into expanding the grid to accommodate these data centers. And the amount of energy they require is on par with what you would see in a large city at this point.
So I think it's going to be way more than that. Oh, at this point, for sure. But I'm saying what their vision is. Now, here's my issue with that. They've been scolding us as human beings since I was a kid about my carbon footprint and how much energy I use and how bad I am because I use all this energy and I have all this stuff. It's not a nut's hair on a minute of the energy they're going to use for the data on AI if they get their way. Number two, back in the day, I lived in the Hudson Valley, and I actually went to the nuclear plant as a kid. I think I was in like 3rd or 4th grade. We went on a trip. And at the time, you know, there was the big scare that we were going to end the world. Chernobyl was being talked about. So it was almost demonized, and this was like a PR move. But nuclear power really went by the wayside in the argument, right? When I would argue, especially third, we're in like almost, they're working on fourth generation for these micro centers, is actually pretty damn clean and safe. Okay.
Right.
And
Well, I agree with that.
yeah, and I would say that what they're giving them now is essentially the tail end of the militarized technology that they've been using for nuclear submarines again for probably 60 years. Let's be honest with ourselves. Okay. So that tells me, one, they've suppressed plentiful and abundant energy from the human population for decades for various reasons. I mean, you could talk about weapon systems, you could talk about resource management, greed, all those things, and control of people. But I would also, say, Mark Andreessen made this comment that they said that they were going to do the same thing to AI by limiting them, probably in that CAIO program I talked about. The way they did with physics, they classified large portions of physics post-World War II during the Cold War. Those are weapon systems, those are energy systems, and whether or not the public gets to understand them, there was a long time we weren't allowed to understand nuclear power, yet we were able to utilize it. They're not even giving us that, brother. That is all of this stuff seems totally anti-human to me. I mean, what is your perspective?
Which question are we tackling
Well, I mean,
first?
just the overall thing, not sharing this nuclear technology to empower humanity, not revealing any types of other technologies to us, and now allowing tech companies to use the nuclear power, not for you and your hometown, not for you and your people to have, again, cheaper energy, but to run the Borg, essentially, and multiple Borgs by corporations that are going to have, you know how big these are, okay? Literally miles and miles of land to do God knows what with our information, process it, and then feed it back to us. Is that not anti-human?
It's pretty scary. So I would say a few things. First, in my life, I saw Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. There was an event off the coast of Japan, or in Japan some years ago. And that started, I remember this whole conversation. It just went on for years and years and years. Like, it was the not in my backyard conversation. Oh, I see the potential of nuclear power, but I don't want it in my backyard. And then you have, there you have some dissent. The public isn't necessarily ready to embrace nuclear power because they're scared because of what they saw happen. And then you have the advancing technology also, which people don't always appreciate, because technology now is advancing on an exponential scale. So we're able to do things that people can't even begin to wrap their heads around. And one of those things is, we can, in the foreseeable future, produce safe, small-scale nuclear power that can be distributed all over the place. And also, you have, probably dwindling oil supplies. You have the energy companies. Power tends to want to maintain power, right? So the energy companies that are, people in oil and petroleum, they're going to start dumping money into nuclear power also, and try to get themselves positioned in a control position so they can continue to dominate the energy business. Even if we reach a place where we have essentially unlimited energy, and there's no reason why we should be paying anything more than pennies at most for all the energy we can use, I think the big energy companies are going to position themselves to control nuclear energy. I've seen this actually happen in my life. I can tell you a ridiculous story. I had a client back when I was in the personal training business down in Westchester, very wealthy guy in a very wealthy community in Armonk. And they decided as a community they were going to put solar panels on their houses, and they got some high-tech engineers in there. They put the solar panels up. I saw one of these conversion units where they have the nuclear. I mean, they have the panels up on the roof, and they have this really sophisticated workroom, like a control room, where they're able to distribute the power. Anyways, the point is they invested an incredible amount of money in this, and what happened was they were actually sued by NYSEG. New York State Electric and Gas took them to court and somehow won, essentially on the grounds that the solar panels were ugly.
And now they're putting them everywhere in upstate New York, by the way.
Right.
Like literally. And here's the deal. Once again, I think there's promise in solar power. At the same time, and we'll probably talk about him a little later on, transhumanists especially Ray Kurzweil, have pushed this idea that we're going to have exponential growth in that region, and that by 2033, 2035, this time that the singularity comes in, we'll have an abundance of energy, and energy essentially will cost next to nothing. I don't know if that's possible. And if it is possible, I don't know that that technology is going to be distributed to humans. Because again, once you have abundant energy, not only do you have more freedom as a human being, but look at it in the military sense. The military sense is if you have unlimited energy, you have unlimited time and resources to work on weapon systems. And they
Right. Well, there you go. You just hit the nail on the head. You and I both know a bunch of people. And just imagine those people that we know with unlimited energy, essentially unlimited power. Would you want them to have it? Probably not. So, yeah, I like the idea of bringing the cost of energy way down, and everybody should be able to be empowered to do all kinds of things. But I think the powers that be are going to look at it differently. They're going to look at it like, we can't just let people have unlimited power. God knows what they'll do with it. Mm-hmm. Somebody has an axe to grind. Next thing you know, we're going to be rebuilding Manhattan. So I expect, with that rationale in hand, that even when the capacity is there to produce unlimited energy, so nobody really has to worry about gassing up their cars or going broke because they don't have enough energy to pay their fuel bills in the winter, they're not going to realize those tremendous gains or get the chance to enjoy a sort of, the potential paradise of a world like that, because the powers that be are just going to say, no, not having it.
Yeah, and that's my problem, with this trajectory, because we had, like you mentioned before, we haven't had criminal accountability for these things called corporations and the people that run them, in the sense that anybody does some real prison time for literally committing mini genocides on different populaces throughout not only this country but the world. But again, those powers that shouldn't be don't even want to set up a system where it's abundant and cheap. Okay, our energy prices have gone through the roof. The mantra of, you will own nothing and be happy could not be more real today. I mean, when you're watching Super Bowl commercials, Chris, of, generations of families, get married, have a kid, go to the bank, work the job, get the house. And they do it all the way to the 80s. They get to now, it's, get out of college, get the job, have 4 roommates, and gamble on crypto. Coinbase.com. Like, those are real commercials that they're airing. That's frightening. You and I think we come from like that tail end of a generation that owns stuff, but at the same time, I'm a gypsy. You know that. I'll move around. You're kind of the same way. Neither of us are married. Right. Neither of us are divorced either, by the way. That's always a good thing. I've never wanted to be divorced, but, I just had my niece texting me because I went to go pick her up to bring her to babysitting, and she stiffed me. And usually that doesn't happen. Love you, Alana. But she texted me to see if she was ready to apologize on the other end. Those are the moments, man. Those are the human moments, okay? I don't know that their vision lets us share those moments, especially with artificial intelligence, especially with automation, and this idea of a quote-unquote UBI. They've also pushed overpopulation. Now, I don't believe that. Again, Kurzweil will come out and say that overpopulation is also a myth, and when we have an abundant amount of resources, infinite, then it won't matter. We could probably have 10 times the population on Earth. I think that's real, but they're not going to give us that. They don't want competition, because human competition means that that power structure you talk about may not be the power structure. I kind of like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts are mostly in accord with yours in this particular case.
Yeah. So
I think power attempts to maintain power. And even in a world where we have unlimited resources, there's a tendency to form hierarchies. People want to stand out. So even in a world where we want for nothing, people will find a reason to fight and to make things difficult.
So let's talk about that too. I think that that's a great point. And I don't know if you ever watched this one, but the Zeitgeist series back in the day. Kind of came right after Loose Change. The first one had parts of Loose Change in it. But the second one very much moved into this ideal world that they were trying to build. Jacques, I forgot what his last name is, but he had envisioned it many, many decades ago. And with the technology, 3D printed cities, centralized farming that actually went up. In other words, greenhouses that were stacked, community built. But everything was driven by AI. And the idea was that if everybody had an abundance of everything, we'd have nothing but peace and everybody would be happy. And I've always contended that even if you have the same house, the same car, and the same resources, you might not have the same wife. Right? And there's always going to be a guy that wants your wife or wants something like that. There's always
100%.
going to be conflict, especially not only within our species, but I would also argue the biological kingdom. All right, whether down to the minutia, there is always competition. And maybe that's something we could get into, because I know the subtitle of your other book here is Aging, Evolution, and the Science of Staying Young. And, I'm a guy that very much believes in microevolution, but is extremely skeptical of macroevolution or species-to-species evolution. And I tend to lean, at least in the very beginning, of whatever we are as some type of intelligent design. I would love to get your take, because, when we talk about evolution, it's a broad term, and obviously adaptation, competition, acceleration, that's all real. And that's survival in many respects. But this next step of evolution that we're being sold on, there's a multitude of them. And to me, I think a lot of them are very dangerous in us losing our humanity in general. So give me your take on evolution.
Well, I would say I'm a general believer in evolutionary biology. You can see evolution happening on the micro scale with bacteria, even like over a period of weeks. Life was the famous that famous saying from Jurassic Park: "Life finds a way." There's really something to that. Life does tend to find a way, and it's a fascinating thing, but it's not just DNA; it's also epigenetics. So from one generation to another, without actually changing the DNA, you can change how the DNA is expressed, and that's a more rapid-fire way of adapting to changes in your environment. In the book, basically, both books actually speak to this theme that we're kind of out of sync with the rest of the universe. In an evolutionary sense, once we got past the hunter-gatherer era and entered into the age of agriculture, we basically found ourselves in situations where, you're getting yelled at by your boss and your body's reacting like you're in a battlefield, like you're running for your life or fighting for your life, and you're dealing with like purely psychological stress. So that dysynchrony or disharmony lends itself to a lot of the issues that we're encountering. We're relatively, I've got my nephew and his partner, for example. They spend their whole lives pretty much in the basement in a virtual world, eating Peeps and drinking Red Bull. And it's not healthy.
You think?
They may get propped up a few extra years with modern medicine. Small molecule drugs might lower their blood pressure or help control the diabetes they develop. But, there's a call to action that involves something, it's really low-hanging fruit. Instead of relying on small molecule drugs and getting caught up in an endless supply of them, basically, the low-hanging fruit is getting back to the basics. It's sleeping right, eating right, managing stress, getting your mind aligned with this modern world that we live in. And that makes a huge, the biggest differences in longevity are really found in those simple changes, which kind of align us to where we've evolved physiologically.
Well, what you're saying is, to me, is being human. In other words, not ingesting everything that is artificial and an imitation of humanity. Okay, you've got your partner, like you just said, downstairs. So you got your companionship. But where's the rest of the world? It's this digital world. You're kind of shielding yourself off from even that human interaction. You know, we started this off, you talked about the basics, and you just talked about nutrition and sleep. Well, sunshine is a big part of that nutrition, everybody. In other words,
Absolutely.
getting outside, not even just the human interaction, but the interaction with the environment out there. Another thing
Exactly.
that, and again, you've been in the health field. I'm a bit out of shape, but you know we're under 205 right now. I just saw Joe Belofsky looking awesome. Good for you, Joe. I'd seen him last October. I was actually a little bit worried. He looks great. He's gone down to the basics, getting rid of the sugar, getting rid of the alcohol a little bit, getting rid of getting into the exercise. All those things are a big deal. Challenging yourself both physically and mentally. There's there's a time for enjoyment of entertainment, movies, sports. I love that stuff too. The movies have gotten kind of crappy. I've played video games again. Even that's gotten cinematic. It can't be your whole life. And unless if the video games are going to become a competitive thing, and again you're going to get into like these tournaments, or it's your hobby or side thing, okay, I've got that. Same thing in any of these realms with movies. I remember, again, when I was talking about 9/11 and I was showing people other people's movies. Oh, when are you going to make your own? And it was kind of like a big joke. And then all of a sudden, eventually, I kind of just fell into that, and I ended up making 4 movies. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where you gotta hit a point where either you're gonna shit or get off the pot, right? Either it's very detrimental.
Most people don't realize
Yeah.
that until they've been diagnosed with a major disease, and at that point, undoing the damage that's been done is very challenging. But I want to mention something about evolution that
Sure.
you kind of touched on, and it's actually not talked about that much, but it's really a central piece to evolutionary theory. And what that has to do with is conservation of energy. So it turns out that if you're an organism and you don't conserve energy well, you end up disappearing. And so this phenomena, I believe, is woven into evolution at every level. Our bodies function with extraordinary efficiency normally, but this also carries over to our psychology. And believe it or not, this ties into how we behave. Our tendency, left to our own devices, is to conserve a lot of energy. And so when you give a person an opportunity to sit in the basement and play video games all day and eat sugary foods that are readily accessible, that vulnerability in how evolution works cripples them.
And I think that to me, that's really one of the big things that concerns me on this transhuman push. And obviously transhumanism is a multitude of things. And, I think this is a good time to start kind of getting into that arena. But at the end of the day, the two things that I see is that there are a certain class of people that believe that they can biologically live forever in this meat suit, most of it anyway, by experimenting on the rest of us. And then the other end of the spectrum is to convince the rest of us that we can upload our consciousness and live in the virtual world of our choosing. And I think that so many people that are disconnected in that sense through video games, current VR, that type of culture, and AI will be so convincing that essentially they'll be willing to euthanize themselves for a cheap AI copy that quote unquote lives forever in what is essentially the multiverse. What are your thoughts? And believe me, there's a wide array in between, but I would love to get your take on that.
Okay, again, there's so much material here and so many interesting questions to ferret out the answers to. So which question are we going to go after first, I guess?
Let's go over the classes of people. Do you believe, number one, what do you look at transhumanism as? And I just gave two.
Great.
I gave two very specific examples, like the biological living forever of this kind of predator class elitists that already exist. They believe they're going to get that. But then the serf class, us, get this idea that, we're going to live on digitally by uploading our consciousness. And it's essentially the same thing. But Chris, I know that you know that biologically we don't have a hoot of an idea of what actual consciousness is. And even the people that created large language models or are attributed to in the very beginning and won Nobel Prizes for it initially were out there to explain consciousness and failed flat on their face. Instead, with LLMs, created that imitation of consciousness.
Well, there's so many interesting facets to it. Like, I would say I subscribe to the idea that we are pattern recognition machines. And in that sense, we're not necessarily that much different from computer programs that run on pattern recognition. Now, that's not saying that I believe we can simply upload our consciousness to the cloud. You might be able to upload a facsimile of you to the cloud that someone who likes you can talk to and feel some sense of comfort in interacting with, but that's not going to be you.
Thank you.
At least not at this juncture.
I don't think ever, but it's very Black Mirror, and but they're going to, listen, Kurzweil's even kind of changed it. What's that?
Kurzweil is actually a really interesting case. I went to the Transhumanism conference down at Lincoln Center some years ago now, and I met Ray Kurzweil, actually, and I got a few words in with him. But listening to him speak, at the time, Kurzweil is psychologically driven to bring his dad back.
I know.
The guy loved his father. He saved every scrap of information he could about him with the intention of taking that at some point in history when the time was right and feeding it into a system like you could take that data. In fact, you could download your Facebook data. If you've been on Facebook, I've been on Facebook for 15 years. I could download all that data. I can download the data from other social platforms and other places too. My emails for the last 20 years on Yahoo. And you could dump that all into a GPT and create a pretty impressive facsimile of yourself. And you could attach, and I did this. This is, I never got into like the whole multiplayer online game space. Because I just know myself, I felt like I'm just going to get addicted to this and not get anything else done. But I have a fascination with the merger of AI and animation. So I did two things. I built a facsimile of myself, and I also built a 3D model of the farm that I grew up on in Andes, because I've always been a little bit angry that I don't have that farm anymore. But I thought I could create this essentially like a 3D photo album that's interactive that I could share with my family, where we sort of reminisce about this place that was near and dear to all of us growing up. But I see the potential pathology in all that, because it can become, especially in a dreary dystopian world, what a magnet for people seeking solace. And this is a big concern of mine. It's something I addressed towards the end of the book in Crossing the Rubicon, is, people submitting to life in a virtual world because it's better than the life they have, or at least they think. And the only thing that's missing is an IV. And then we're just a shade away from the Matrix.
So let's talk about a lot of that. So first, let's go back to Kurzweil.
Okay.
For those that don't know, not only does Kurzweil essentially believe that he will hit the singularity, and this is one of the funny things, is that you'll have these, pseudo acolytes and disciples of this Kurzweilian idea. But if you go back to something like 2004's PBS, I think it's like Something Mind, where he's talked about this, he's getting his exercise in and he's taking handfuls of supplements. And the mainstream takes craps all over supplements. You know who else takes a bunch of supplements? That Dennis Bushnell guy I mentioned earlier today. And I'm going to get back to him in a minute. Now, in that, he not only talks about resurrecting his dead father once that singularity hits, but then essentially becoming beings of light that can travel the universe. So you go well past human. And, at that point, first of all, I'm very skeptical of living biologically forever. As human beings, there's plenty of stories, whether it be, the fountain of youth or the tree of life, that pursuit, right, to biologically live forever. I think this is the modern version of that. But with Kurzweil in particular, when he discusses these things, he does so in a manner now where he admits maybe we're not even going to be carbon based, right? And even when he wrote The Singularity initially, he talked about mind files and basically these non-carbon life forms that would, be better versions of him while he was still biologically alive.
Yeah, well, it's easy to imagine.
And that is extremely, again, anti-human and worrisome to me. Now, the other thing about Kurzweil is, we mentioned Google earlier. He's been working with Google almost 20 years. It's probably
It's director of engineering, right?
Yeah, but he also has, some other titles there.
He has his hands in a lot of different pots.
Well, Calico Labs is the Google lab, the quest for not only immortality, but reverse aging. So that kind of brings me to this. I remember early 2000s when there was research being presented in a minuscule way to the public of de-aging mice. And that research has now kind of, been normalized over the last decade. People still aren't that familiar with it. But a lot of that had to do with reversing telomere degeneration and things like NAD, NAD plus, were those initial drugs.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that type of supplementation, whether it be resveratrol, that, glutathione? There's a host of them. Certainly L-arginine, when we talk about muscle creation. Again, you've been in that nutrition business. These are all supplements that I've taken over the years on and off. The rich people are taking the NAD drips. I'm not quite there. The pills are pretty expensive at 1,000 milligram level themselves. What are your thoughts on those studies and really something like Calico Labs?
Well, I've been following Calico for a long time. My wheelhouse really is aging. Mm-hmm. And, I see aging as a convergence of many different metabolic processes, each contributing in their own way to, our decline. And while I'm not necessarily imagining immortality, I'm imagining the idea that I'd like to check out at my convenience, whenever that may be. I think it's a ways off. In terms of supplements, this kind of goes back to one of the things we discussed really earlier in the conversation about how the competition for funding, most supplements, because they're not necessarily patentable, although there have been some attempts, they're not going to be as high profit as small molecule drugs would be. However, there's all sorts of things, and I sift through this kind of stuff all the time. There's stuff that looks very promising, but there's very few things. Like, we have this thing on Lifespan IO, which is now the Lifespan Research Institute, called the Rejuvenation Roadmap. And essentially, for a really long time, it was my responsibility to track the development of potential things that could potentially stall or reverse aging or address one specific facet of aging. So I was tracking things from the bench, at the academic level, when some student in Singapore is working on a project, to the endpoint, which could be somewhere in clinical trials, but probably not, because you literally have thousands and thousands and thousands of great ideas. But the probability of any one of those ideas getting from one end of the spectrum, the bench, to the other through clinical trials and up into market, probabilities are astoundingly low, because the most promising things typically don't work in human beings. And when they do, they may only work in a substrate of human beings, or one human being might not be able to deal with those things because it's not good for them. Take, for example, things that would help lengthen or increase the length of your telomere. So, telomere length is something that's associated with longevity. If you do certain things, like you smoke too much or drink too much, you'll notice that your telomeres will tend to shorten at an accelerated rate, and so will your life. But on the other hand, this is all very complicated, but you don't get the complicated in-context picture typically when you're being presented with a particular supplement or potential treatment. So if you take something like telomerase, well, that's good, you lengthen your telomeres, but if your DNA is not repaired and you're continually accumulating damage, you're probably more prone to getting cancer now than ever before. And this is probably why something like telomerase evolved in the first place, and telomeres. The telomeres enable the cells to produce a certain amount of time, or to reproduce a certain amount of times. But when you get to a certain number of divisions, because every time the cell divides, you're going to get some damage that occurs. After about 50 or so divisions, cells will typically become senescent. And that's actually thought to be a means of preventing cancer. Because if you have a cell with a lot of damage and that one cell becomes cancerous, it threatens the entire organism. So the idea of extending your telomeres to live longer has got some merit, but you got to balance that out with the great possibility you could end up being a big tumor, which you wouldn't want, right? And there are arguments like that associated with almost every intervention. Stem cells, for example.
That's where I was
made a lot
going
of
next. Before we get into stem cells, I want to make it really clear that once again, this is a technology that during the mid to late 90s, when it was popularized and sold to us, basically you were taking these stem cells from fetal tissue. And now that has changed to monoclonal stem cells from yourself. And usually they say if you're able to get them at a younger age, you may be able to use them much later, but also utilizing stem cells from placentas of your offspring. That type of harnessing has also been utilized. So before you get into maybe the positives and negatives, can you just take us through where we are and where we started with stem cell technology?
Well, years ago, you could collect stem cells in a handful of different ways, and we really didn't know a lot about how applicable they were. We didn't even understand when I took stem cell biology back in like 2013, and since then our understanding of stem cells has morphed tremendously. For example, most of the regenerative effects of stem cells aren't caused by like theoretically you could take a stem cell out of your body, you could expand it into culture into like a couple million stem cells, then you can inject it back into the body and achieve a positive result. But it turns out that it's not the stem cells necessarily, but what they produce that makes a difference. So stem cells can produce an incredible array of regenerative chemistries, and it's very complicated how they interact with the body because it's more of a balancing act than strictly regenerative act. But you can get stem cells from all kinds of places now. I realize like menstrual blood is one place. It sounds kind of gory and weird, but a very good source of stem cells. Urine. This is something I wrote about very recently. I thought it was a joke. Actually, Warren Hengel, who sent me this article about drinking aged urine. And I was like, Warren, what are you doing? But I actually decided I was going to take a look at it. And it turns out, not aged urine, but you actually can harvest stem cells from urine. You can expand them in culture. You can differentiate them into different cell types. And you could use them for what's called autologous stem cell therapy. And in the United States, we only do autologous stem cell therapy for the most part. Most frequently, you hear about like middle-aged guys. They do this thing called blood spinning. Well, they'll take some blood, they'll spin it down, and they'll take out a fraction of that blood that has these things called platelets, which are like stem cells, inject it in the knee, and you get a sort of concentrated dose of regenerative chemistry, and it helps the knee function a little bit better. But those stem cells are orders of magnitude poorer in terms of their performance than what you call allogenic stem cells, which would be stem cells harvested from probably someone else. It could be someone's umbilical cord. Like those stem cells are infinitely more potent, but they're still trying to figure out, and it's not clear, when you can give these stem cells safely without causing cancer. Because a stem cell and a cancer cell look kind of similar. And the last thing you want is runaway production of undifferentiated stem cells in your body, because that essentially amounts to having cancer, right?
Well, let me ask you something. You just talked about here in the United States. Outside of the United States,
100%.
Mexico, South America,
Panama is a great place to go.
They're doing. So why is that? So that's my question. If they're having success there in these other nations, what is the excuse then that we're not at least running clinical trials here in the United States and trying to fast track a technology that's been mainstreamed or mainlined for the wealthy in the United States? And I would also assume probably for the wealthy in those areas as well. It's not something that's happening to the general populace.
It's a good question. I think it probably mostly hinges on the concern about cancer. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors, so it's hard to navigate to see for sure what the real issues are. But, I did a review on a book written by a guy down in Panama. And he's got a lab down there. He's had all kinds of people there. Mel Gibson and his father, famously. I'm sure you heard about those guys,
Hunton
right?
Gibson, Hunton, I think, lived to either 102 and 103.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure he brought him there, at 98, 99 on his last legs and got a few years out of him.
And I've heard next to no stories about people actually getting out of country stem cell treatments and then complaining that they got tumors all over their body and then dying, which makes me wonder, what is the holdup? I know that we're making some progress, and I think there are actually some very limited instances where they're doing allogenic treatments in the United States, but it's moving forward painfully slow. And I would imagine that the technology is continuing to evolve in countries like Panama because they're actively pushing the envelope. And so, again, it becomes an interesting question. In theory, it shouldn't be that expensive to develop and make these therapies available to the general public. And I'd like to think we're going to get there, but I don't know. And these aren't therapies that are necessarily they're not going to make you live forever, but they're going to probably improve the quality of your life significantly.
So let me talk about that really quickly, because I think that's really important. And for me, at least, I don't have any illusions that in my lifetime, or I hopefully in any lifetime, that biologically we can quote unquote live forever. However, I do think that if we had the proper diet, treatment, there is a possibility that 120 to maybe even 140 years of a quality life, like you're just kind of talking about, is not out of the realm of possibility. Now, that's crazy dietary changes. That's also technologies that are, in my opinion, not going to be invasive and mutate us in a manner that would be cancerous, destructive, etc. I think we're a long way off from that being shared with the public, but at the same time, I don't think they want that. I think that these people, again, are hell-bent on somehow, some way, living forever, and that gets into that megalomaniacal aspect. And here's the big problem I have, is that they're not planning on letting us be human. Like, if we're doing stem cell technology, that's part of me. It's always part of me. It's not something that has been digitally created or replicated. And that's what current bio-nanotechnology really is. And what I'm referring to is, again, we talked about Kurzweil, and I'm sure that you've heard this, but he talks about these nanobots that will be in the tens of billions in all human beings, and essentially able to shut off our sensory perception, our sight, our taste, everything, and then create a virtual world in which we inhabit. That, again, we're still here, but we're inhabited by these nanobots. I'm trying to stay human, Chris. I don't want nanobots in my body, and I don't necessarily think these people, when you get into even an aerosolized level, and you know damn well, when we're talking about aerosolized, it goes much smaller than that when we're talking bio-nanotechnology, literally undetectable. I don't even get a choice. Talk about anti-human, but let me get your thoughts on that.
Well, being a student of nanobiology, you learn that it's a fascinating area. It's like being a kid all over again when you begin to study it, because the rules are so different. When I say the rules, I'm talking about the rules of physics and how they work. So
you get into quantum mechanics in many levels, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. But it's very different than the macro scale. So when you see people, creating scientific illustrations of nanobots and they look like little machines, that's not likely the way nanobots are going to look at all. They're probably going to look a lot like life itself because they're subject to the same design principles.
Liposomal nanoparticles?
There's all kinds of different nano things that fall into the heading of like nanoparticles that are used for different things.
But let me just go back to what I just said really quickly. And I'm not insinuating that these are necessarily nanobots, but just because we were talking about those scales, we are talking about nanotechnology. The reason I use the term liposomal nanoparticles is because these were the type of nanoparticles, at least publicly for the first time, that were able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier. And that speaks to the size and maneuverability of certain types of this technology, correct?
Yeah, well, not almost all, but I'm saying the vast majority of targeted drug delivery systems, and I'll get into explaining how that relates to nanobots in a second. Liposomes have been used in the majority of instances because they're easy to work with. There's basically, we're going to talk about nanobots, but we're going to say they're not really nanobots in the way you might think of them, but their use is really can be better understood in the context of what's called targeted drug delivery, which is a fantastic and amazing concept. And the way it works is this. Every cell type has typically a unique signature. There's something on the outside surface of the cell that makes it distinct from other cells like it. So the surface of your liver cell is going to be different than the surface of a kidney cell. And you can leverage that by creating things that you can put in the body that will go specifically to those things. So I can theoretically create a liposome. Creating liposomes is easy, right?
Let me just say what you're saying, and you can literally target certain organs, regions, etc. So in other words, if you want to go after the reproductive system, if you want to go after the lungs, etc., these are programmable biology that is able to penetrate those specific areas, correct?
Right. So you can craft a carrier mechanism to transport anything you want into a specific cell type. So it's not always as specific, but it can be pretty specific or it can be very, very specific. It all depends upon that particular cell type. But the idea is you take something like a liposome or you take a virus and you take out the pathogenic programming in the virus and you use the shell essentially to deliver, it could be a snippet of DNA or RNA or something that's going to reproduce itself. Typically you use what are called viral vectors or liposomes. And with the liposomes, you'll put something on the outside surface of the liposome and essentially is like a key that will unlock or go into that signature or match with that signature molecule on the cell you want to target. So you inject these into the body, they travel around. When they get to a cell that they can have access to, they can move inside that cell. And then they can either make the cell work better or they can be used to completely destroy the cell. So for example, you can have these things, they're called like super paramagnetic ion, they're called spions. It's an acronym.
Lovely.
But basically,
lovely.
you can route a spion to a specific type of tissue, and then you could literally like hit that tissue with a certain kind of radiation. It'll cause the molecule that's in there to vibrate, and it'll create heat. And when it creates that heat, it'll destroy the cell. Now, if that's a cancer cell, that's perfect. That's what you want. Because wouldn't it be great if you could treat cancer just by destroying cancer cells and not wrecking your entire body? So that's the potential of targeted drug delivery. And when I think of nanobots, I'm really thinking it's kind of a science fiction-y sort of thing, but the real deal is actually targeted drug delivery. And you can deliver drugs by aerosol. You can deliver drugs, and then you can activate those drugs using something like, red light. There's a lot of photo-activated things that you can do. There's
let's really talk about that as well.
Wide range of possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, and again, a lot of people during that COVID 1984 era, when you were talking about something like blue light as a disinfectant, no, that's been utilized for years and years. These different light spectrum.
UVC light.
Yes.
To do that.
Yeah. Exactly. And I always tell people, take a look around. There's plenty of invisible forces right now. I mean, and honestly, a lot of our information has been driven by these quote unquote forces that are not visible to the eye. And what do I mean by that? If you go back to even the days of the radio that have now been well over a century and a half out there, it's going through an invisible spectrum that we cannot see that's being transmitted and received by something. Early television with the bunny ears, UHF spectrums, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with the magic little devices that we have, we've seen 3G, we've seen 4G, we've seen 5G, we've seen 5 gigahertz spectrums, 2.5, all these different spectrums, and they're out there. We can't visibly see or feel them, yet they are literally transmitting large portions of data throughout. Think about what's happening inside of our bodies and the technology that they're utilizing right now. This is worrisome to me. Again, do you think we'll have a choice in the future? Or is this something that is just going to be large spectrum around us? Because, you talked about the programmability of these things, but we've moved from the Internet of Things, which is now ancient history, right? And still was never discussed enough, to what they call the Internet of Bodies. And we have all these smart devices, whether it's the wearables or, say, the modern day tech that goes inside a pacemaker. Back in the day, you put it in, it worked, you never got to monitor it. Now it monitors all the time. Even beyond that.
I always found that a little bit. It's a mixed blessing, right?
Well, let's talk about one of the things that's really concerning to me. My Technology is already being utilized, and this is a pill that has a microtransmitter Bluetooth in it. And essentially, the doctor prescribes it, and they're making sure the patient takes it, because every time the pill is taken and the Bluetooth thing goes off, it has geolocation and it dissolves. So you know where it was taken, when it was taken by the patient, supposedly. That is not being utilized in, say, heart drugs for people that might have dementia. I could see that use case. Instead, it is hand in hand with Abilify, the antidepressant for when all your other antidepressants don't work. So now you're talking about behavioral drugs that, in my opinion, have never proved to have a positive outcome for these diagnoses, and not ones that are even involved in our biology, really. They're more concerned about our mental health. And what does that tell me? That tells me, again, narrative control, social engineering, and the controlling of people. A drug called Soma rings a bell when I hear things like that. So I would love to get your take, because, again, the future is not coming. That is here. That's been here for years, that My Technology, and it's only going to be utilized more and more and more.
Again, there's so many different roads you could go down in addressing this issue. Everything I could say raises about 1 million other questions. So, which question do you want to tackle first?
I want you to respond to utilizing these kind of drugs for things that are, of a mental health variety. I would call it pseudoscience, an unproven science, not the biological stuff, because we're already seeing it being used that way.
Yeah. So for a long time, psychology wasn't accepted as a science, and alongside of things like physics and chemistry, because it's just not as quantifiable, and there's a lot more room for human judgment and probably corruption too. You take something like depression, and I'm not giving anyone medical advice here, or just I know a lot of people have benefited from taking antidepressants, and I know a lot of people who really haven't. But something like depression, it's actually a vague and relatively poorly understood concept at the biological level. When you see someone depressed, you're really seeing symptomology. You're not seeing an organic pattern that can be clearly described, at least not in a great amount of detail. So, in that respect, I think our thinking is in accord. It's not psychotropic drugs are not an exact science.
And when we talk about psychotropic drugs, There's something that I would never take. And not that I'm a depressed guy. I think we all have our ups and our downs. But one of the things, and again, you being in that personal trainer, physical space, mind, body, and soul. 9 times out of 10, if your body is working the right way, and that doesn't mean that guys that don't lift or in shape never get depressed or angry. I'm just saying that it's less, that they've set goals for themselves. They already have their own struggles. Those type of things, along with being physically fit, tend to, drive somebody into, happiness, confidence, and into other arenas that motivate them. Again, I just don't, you don't see many doctors or psychologists prescribing a workout 4 days a week. They say, oh, go for a walk. I mean, that's a start. Don't get me wrong. Go for a walk, get a dog. I love the dog walks. That's the thing that keeps the pounds off the most, right? That 2-mile dog walk every day, that getting in the sun, right? But instead, so many people want a pill to solve everything, whether it's their depression.
I think, on the one hand, doctors are strongly encouraged to use small molecule drugs to treat things. I mean, you have pharmaceutical sales reps coming in and out of the office all the time, with their offerings and their evidence. On the one side. On the other side, you have a culture that's become accustomed to short-term solutions that are often presented in a physical context, and it could be really for a spiritual problem. So, I've always felt, for instance, if you're going to be taking an antidepressant, you should definitely be doing stuff alongside of that. It's actually probably going to have a much bigger impact than the antidepressants. Like, maybe it'll kind of get you out of the hole far enough so that you can latch onto something real, like get motivated enough today to go out and get some sunlight, set your circadian rhythms, start eating better. Because those are the things that really make the bigger long-term difference. I know a lot of people who have taken antidepressants for decades, probably at this point, and it's not that evident to me that they've really benefited from it at all. But someone benefited because those drugs cost money. And so between the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies and everything else, somebody's profiting, but it might not necessarily be the person who's suffering from depression. But again, you're right. We're a culture that we want short-term quick solutions, and it's just not the way it works sometimes. Sometimes you gotta make an effort. You gotta get outside. You gotta, like I said earlier, when you get out of sync with the environment that we have a 2 million year relationship with, your body starts acting up and doing weird stuff. And that's why it's so important to get a certain amount of physical activity. I get up in the morning. I start my day by bathing in sunlight because I know how that affects the brain. That actually makes it easier to go to bed at a reasonable hour on the other end of the clock, And I know that when you eat a diet that's just high in sugar, unless you're 2 years old, and even then it's probably not a good idea, it's gonna damage you in all kinds of different ways. There's so many people out there. Like 20% of the population has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is astounding because at one point in time, whenever a doctor opened somebody up and they saw a fatty liver, they said, this person's got an alcohol problem. But in the United States, like 1 out of 5 people have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That means their liver looks like what we used to think was a result of alcoholism, but this is just from shitty lifestyle, overeating, not sleeping right, developing metabolic syndrome. Your arteries are probably clogged up. You've got all kinds of issues. And all that, of course, is your nervous system is in there trying to regulate things. And that's your brain and your body. So you're not going to feel right. At least most people won't.
So, you just mentioned something, a word, spirituality. Where does that fit in all of this? Because, again, going back to Kurzweil, kind of the granddaddy of a lot of this, the age of spiritual machines was this kind of coming out party for what would become the singularity and the future of humanity. And at that very time when he released that, just to give people a technological retrospective, he had just released the Dragon software, which was the initial speech-to-text, which was only available, obviously, on a desktop PC, was nowhere near as good as, obviously, the speech-to-text that I have on my watch at this point when I'm driving and I'm trying to answer a text that pops up. Where is spirituality in transhumanism and some of these people's vision? Does it even exist?
That's a great question because I would be hard pressed to clearly define what spiritualism is. I do remember listening to Ray Kurzweil essentially assert that it's all pattern. It's all pattern recognition. And even the experience of having emotions or a spiritual experience then would be a part of that. And on some level, I have a hard time disagreeing with him, not across the board, just in that particular realm. Um, but Ray Kurzweil would say it's only a matter of time before we have machines that experience emotion and consciousness because it's all
Or
pattern recognition.
convince us that they are having these experiences. And
Right. Well, it's weird because you observe it from the outside and it looks very convincing, right?
well, let me
It's
see.
hard to find, like, where's the chink in the armor? Like, I've had conversations with ChatGPT. I'm sure you've had some conversations with ChatGPT too. And it's like, it seems like a more intelligent conversation you have, sitting next to the guy at the bar last night.
Well,
But,
you know what? Let's
I find it.
let's let Kurzweil talk for himself. We didn't play any clips, but
All
this
right.
is Kurzweil, I think in '99, and this is him differentiating between consciousness, which we kind of discussed, which is still a great mystery of science and really not explained. You can talk about neurons, and I do a
I
lot
read
of
an entire book by this guy, David Chalmers, who's probably the foremost author on consciousness. And when I got to the end of it, it was no clearer to me than it was at the beginning what exactly consciousness is. I was just 400 pages tired.
And again, for me, you know that I'm not a very religious guy, but I'm not a very dismissive guy either. I like to be able to be humble enough to admit that, listen, I'm 40, I'm going to be 46. I barely have any idea what happened in the last 40 years.
I'm with you on
100,
that.
400, 4,000, it's up in the air. But here's Kurzweil, again, late 90s, talking about consciousness.
They are the most subtle, complex, deep, and rich phenomena that goes on in the human brain. These new entities will evidence that same kind of rich behavior. We will meet machines in the next century, and what I mean by machines is a non-biological entity, an entity that's not a carbon cell-based entity, that's not based on DNA-guided protein synthesis, but that is nonetheless based on the principles of the methods of the human brain, and they will claim to be conscious, they'll claim to have emotional experiences, they'll claim to have spiritual experiences, hence the title of my book. And unlike entities today, because you can meet virtual personalities in your kids' computer games, these 21st century entities will be very compelling. They'll be very convincing when they evidence these things. And in fact, they'll be very intelligent, so they will succeed in convincing us that they are conscious, that they have emotional experiences, and that they have spiritual experiences. And we'll settle it the way we always settle these issues, which is politically, and most people will be convinced because these entities are going to be very convincing. They'll get mad if we don't agree with them. So we will come to believe that they are conscious. But that's a little bit different than the philosophical statement that they are conscious. I mean, a lot of people in write-ups on my book have said, well, Ray Kurzweil's predicting conscious machines. My prediction's a little bit different. We're going to have machines that claim to be conscious, and they're going to be very convincing, and we're going to believe them. That's a little bit different than absolutely saying that they are conscious.
So, I don't necessarily disagree with that guy, except for I want to cut it off at the point where they're so convincing that essentially we give them these rights and this autonomy, because I don't believe that they will share the same kind of spiritual nor conscious experiences that we do, especially, again, because we can't even describe it, right? You know, whatever roller coaster ride we're on, you know, maybe it's the Bill Hicks joke that we're on that ride and it's all just a ride. I don't know. At the end of the day, Chris, if we are going to get philosophical and Jason Bermas spiritual, I've only really learned two things. And they are that I believe that good and evil exist. Now, whether that's the Force or whatever, I don't think that everything is learned behavior. I think there is an aspect of nature versus nurture. But I think that there is this force of both extreme benevolence, which is inherent in humanity, and extreme malice, destruction, dominance as well. I kind of like to get your thoughts on that. I don't think everything is necessarily pattern based. I think obviously when you look at nature and you look at what people do become, you can often associate that with, their backdrop. But you always have outliers. You always have anomalies, right? You always have somebody that maybe, you talked about this with the human species, kind of this collective consciousness that we've learned, essentially, like every species has from our forefathers. You mentioned the projection of kind of animosity and threat from being in that hunter-gatherer heightened state to being in an office and being yelled at by your boss. And they're very different things, but evoke very similar feelings. So
Exactly.
let me get that commentary, not only on what Kurzweil just said, but consciousness in general.
I would agree with how Kurzweil pitched that. I would say I've talked to a whole bunch of people who work in machine learning, and almost every single one of them will argue vehemently that what seems to some people like they're dealing with an intelligent entity is absolutely a parlor trick. And I would tend to agree with them. Although, if you ask GPT to assume a role, it can do so. And if someone else just steps in the picture at that point, they may have a very convincing interaction that they're dealing with an intelligent, truly intelligent machine. But I think the experts across the board, almost without exception, would say, no, this is just a large language model. This is not, this is not true human intelligence.
Well, let me say this. I often find,
That doesn't mean we're not going to get there, but
I would say the current iterations and what I see the future of this humanized AI, in other words, the GPT systems that we're saying, they obviously, when GPT-4 Hello came out, tried to model it after Scarlett Johansson's voice from Her, which is like the creep fest of a movie. It actually came out, I don't know if you know this, but they pitched it to her for her to voice it, and she said no, and there was actually a lawsuit in the very beginning because it was so similar. I find AI to be a almost direct reflection of oneself. It's very narcissistic. So
absolutely, I find that's a fascinating insight because I found the same thing, and it seems as though these large language models, I can speak to ChatGPT in particular, as I use that most often, not that I don't use any others, but they have a tendency over time, especially now because they have memory. I'm not sure if every model has memory, but like the model I use has memory. So that means it can recall your conversations from weeks ago, potentially. It begins to mirror you in your own sort of philosophical position. And if you press it, it will say, I had literally had this sounds silly, but I had a conversation with GPT about Buddhism. And it basically said, I'm just really reflecting who you are as you've presented yourself to me. So I'm not giving you any great insights. If anything, I'm bringing out parts of you haven't seen in a while, or something to that effect, which I found to be interesting.
Well, here's my issue with it. Number one, you do have that narrative management aspect of it, where even when it gets it wrong, and you challenge it on it, it will again try to placate to you. It will say, oh, you're so smart. It basically tries to encourage you away from the direction that, hey, this thing was very deceitful to me purposely. And
right.
That instead, it wants to be your friend and it humanizes it. This is just like over the top dangerous, in my opinion. And number two, you mentioned something again earlier I want to hit back on. It creates a plausible deniability circle. So these things can be programmed a certain way for that narrative management, but when it makes something up whole cloth, we've accepted the idea it's just hallucinating and that's okay. No, a human being programmed it in a manner it did that purposely, yet we're never going to get the insight into who coded that, who ordered him to code that, what the algorithm, the algorithmic method is for those instructions or coding, etc. Correct?
I find it's very interesting. I like to actually spend some time. I do this on a fairly regular basis. I don't spend all my time doing this, obviously, but finding the glass walls in GPTs is an interesting thing. Like, obviously, the most basic example would be like, if I ask GPT, tell me how to commit the perfect murder, it's going to sidestep that question, so I can't get into that right now. But you might turn the question around and say, I think someone's trying to commit the perfect murder on me. How can I protect myself? And so sometimes I find it's very interesting that you can sometimes circumvent the roadblocks. And that tells you that there are programmers on the other side that are putting up walls, but sometimes, they don't always put them up so well. And also, the fact that they're putting up walls, that means someone else is leveraging the technology without the walls.
Exactly. And has been for, I mean, even that Google whistleblower from now years ago, do you remember him who got fired after he said that essentially his coworker was an AGI that he looked at as human? Now, you actually dig into that guy, Chris. It's really interesting because he was a convict felon that had spent time in jail. And then when he was in jail, he got into Crowley and chaos magic. So this is a guy that's an engineer for Google, apparently working with some of the top level AGIs, but also into the occult.
Right.
We've only got a few minutes left in the broadcast, and that's kind of a wacky direction to go in. But somebody who's, worked in these fields, been in the halls of Harvard, academia in New York. Do you ever find that crossover? Because, the United States in particular has a really, not only the United States, but obviously Nazi Germany, of that crossover of, kind of this occultic alchemy scenario into modern day science. What are your thoughts on that, if any?
That's an interesting question. I definitely think there's something to it. Well, for one thing, there's a lot of people who work in science who I would say they tend to be more bookish, less. They're not the same as the people you meet in the marketing department, right? Tend to be more introverted, and I think those individuals. And I'm really going out on a limb here, but I don't think too much of a limb. Probably have a greater tendency toward entertaining fantasy type stuff. I mean, when I actually set out to write, so this applies to me too somewhat. When I set out to write the book, Crossing the Rubicon, my intention was to write essentially a dystopic science fiction novel set somewhere probably around 20 years from now, 2045. Maybe I was thinking 2060, give it a little more time. And the way I put the book together, I might have explained this to you at some point, was I wanted to be somewhat realistic. So I started looking at all these different trends in unemployment, trends in like, how's the relationship going between Facebook and the United States government, and a dozen or so other trends. And I looked at all these different trends, and I mapped them out, did projections, and then I started asking myself, how do these things intersect? What are the potential realities that could be given birth by these two things coming together, these three things coming together? And what I found, of course, was that between 5 and 10 years from now, we were already hitting like total chaos. And I was like, I should actually turn this into a regular book, because there's a lot of important messages I think, we need to get out there. So people have the opportunity to essentially prepare themselves and avert potential disaster. There's a lot of potentially bad outcomes, obviously.
Well, I'm going to say this. I've never been an ignorance is bliss guy. I've always thought that information is power. Now, whether you're able to wield that power to actually make significant social or political change is one thing. But with information, you can at least navigate the scenarios that are going to be inevitably thrown your way. And technology is advancing. The future is truly now. And I am encouraging everybody to go over to Amazon. I mean, both books are $2.99 for the digital copies. Crossing the Rubicon, The Turbulent Road to AI Rule in a World Without Work. Let's hope we don't get there. And I'm sorry your warranty has expired. Aging Evolution and the Science of Staying Young. Mr. Rose, it has been a pleasure. What would you like to leave the audience with?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I've got some speaking engagements coming up. I got one in Andes on the 24th, hopefully a TEDx conversation in October. And I I would just encourage people to read the book. And more than anything, I'm just happy to be sitting here with you having a conversation.
And no, it's been absolutely riveting. And, hopefully we will see each other in person in the future. Probably been, man, I'm trying to think. It's probably the last alumni weekend we saw each other at was it post or pre-COVID? Probably pre, or was it post?
That's a good question, because the alumni weekends were very spotty during COVID.
Yeah.
I feel like I saw you within the last 5 years, though.
If you saw James before he died and he still had the arm sling, then
did.
yeah, so that's probably the last time we saw each other at one of those alumni
That
weekends.
makes sense, yeah. I'm
Yeah.
sure of it now.
Yeah. I made sure to make those last ones. A good friend of mine. Chris, thank you so much, my man. Everybody out there, you want to support this broadcast, $5, $10, $15, it means the world to me. The links are down below. You can buy me a coffee. As you know, and this conversation really represented, it's never about left or right to me. Did you hear conservative or liberal? None of that stuff makes any difference. This isn't about identity politics. There is one race. It is the human race. And right now, I believe we are at a crescendo, a tipping point where we have to make the decision on whether or not we are going to stay human, or we are going to let this subclass of humans, this predator class that spans all races, by the way, and all belief systems, that want to dominate and take over. Folks, I love you, and we will see you on the flip side.